Thank you all for coming. LabTalks started for us 3 years ago, and it was 3 of us in a WeWork crowded around a small mic, a very poor quality video. So it's really awesome to see you all here today in what is an amazing venue. And really what today is about is the ad-funded internet, an internet that's free, that's accessible, and really how the internet should be, which is at a little bit of a risk at the moment. We're seeing more paywalls, there's cookies that are disappearing, and ultimately the internet is funded by content, right? Well, content is funded by the internet and advertisers that want to reach the people that are looking at that content. Brilliant. So I'm going to start off with a brief history lesson. It's not long, it's not boring. We're then going to talk about the adoption of blockchain globally, and then kind of more specifically as it relates to adtech. And then to take us home, kind of what is the new era of adtech, a Web3 infrastructure that supports the ad-funded internet. But first, the history lesson starts. So imagine the year, it's 1994. Simba has just been presented at Pride Rock for the very first time. Forrest Gump has laced his shoes and made the profound statement that life is in fact like a box of chocolates. But there was a lot of things that were released to market for the first time, technology amongst other things. We had infinite battery on our phone. We all played Snake. Some of us were good at predictive text, some of us weren't. But really, this was the beginning of mobile, the long-fated year of the mobile, but ultimately the beginning of technology. If we roll on again. We played games on these. We didn't have any analog sticks. 8 megabytes was all that you really needed to play all of the games that you wanted, but things have changed now. We have terabyte-based consoles. GTA's gone from 1D to what might even be 4D with a cryptocurrency-based market. Technology's really come a long way since 1994. And this was our first internet browser, Netscape 1.0. And this really was the start or the move from Web 1, where the internet was read-only, to read and write. So the ability to post content, to interact with content, to like stuff for the very first time, which now, 30 years on from that, we're looking at Web 3, where it's read, write, and own. And there was one other big invention, I think, particularly for the ad tech people in the room, that was quite fundamental, was cookies that were invented. Now, they were invented because e-commerce started to exist with read and write browsers, and it was really to store the information about what you had in your basket so you could check out at some point. And that has really expanded in terms of its uses. It now remembers which page you're on, and I think importantly for ad tech is a real key in behavioral-based targeting and attribution models, and really has built the market to what it's become today. But what that means is that the ad tech market is now using infrastructure that's 30 years old. And I think a lot of people here will know that a lot of the issues that we faced 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago are still the same today. We suffer with discrepancies, with a lack of transparency, and really not understanding what's going on when you're buying media, when you're selling media, when you're trying to target media. And that's something that really does need to be addressed. The cool thing about this, what is quite ancient technology now, is it supports an entire industry that's worth $600 billion. It's not a small sum of money. It's bigger than a lot of countries' gross domestic products. And by 2028, it's going to be over $1 trillion, which is a big number by anyone's kind of imagination. And I think the best way to think about this infrastructure is with a metaphor. And anyone that knows me knows I love to thrash a metaphor to death. So you now will get to experience this. You can imagine ad tech and the infrastructure that provides it as a house. So like your front of house, really you're creative, and that's where you entertain your guests. It's where all your smart TV fixtures are. And then if you think about the data and the creative, for data and the targeting and the measurement, it's like the kitchen is where you prepare the food for your guests. And then you have the basement. The basement is the infrastructure. No one's been down there for 30 years. It's where you've hidden your old golf clubs. Your children may or may not think there's some monsters there, but really you're not as proud of it as you should be. And I think that's really where we are as an ad tech industry, is we need to now pay attention to that basement, look at it, tidy it up, make it presentable, perhaps put your kids down there, who knows, but really improve your entire house rather than the bits that people see. And when you look at that infrastructure, technically it looks more like this. The numbers you're seeing here is from ISBA, so one of the oldest advertising bodies, looked at the supply path all the way through from an advertiser to a publisher and the fees that are being taken there. And you can see there's quite a lot. 43% is lost between the buyer and the seller. So a lot of value is lost. If you're a publisher, you're not making as much money as you should do. If you're an advertiser, you're not getting as much media for your money as perhaps that you should. And it needs to be addressed. And I think what's interesting about this is that whilst it said 9% for DSP fees, if you look at publicly available information about a very large DSP, their gross margin is much larger than that. And I think anecdotally from campaigns that we've run, although the information says there's a 43% delta, in some instances it's significantly higher than that. We found inventory can be up to 200% cheaper when you're buying through a blockchain. And really, when you think about the ISBA study, there was, I think, 1 billion or so impressions that were measured, but only 5% of those were measured from the buyer all the way through to the seller, which I think is where you probably realize these fees that are perhaps slightly higher than what's being reported in well-renowned, well-reported studies like ISBA did in 2022. And there needs to be a solution to this. I am, I'd say at this point, IVing the Kool-Aid as far as blockchain is concerned, but there's a reason for that. And that is blockchain. You know, this is something that was created 16 years ago. And what we're looking at here is a graph of the adoption of the internet, which coincidentally lines up quite nicely with the adoption of blockchain. So as far as the internet has progressed, we're here. There's about 420 million wallets of people that use blockchain globally, which puts us in about 2001, which is kind of pre-internet boom. So really, if you want to draw a comparison to how the internet's being adopted to blockchain, we're at the beginnings of what could be a fundamental change in the infrastructure that not only just powers financial transactions, but can broadly be applied to many industries, of which we think adtech, advertising, media is a brilliant candidate for. And it's not just being adopted in a small way. I think if you follow the blockchain news like myself and the team in the office do, there's some really serious players now that are trying to now regulate blockchain. BlackRock, Vanguard, Fidelity have created an exchange-traded fund. And really, for those of people that have never come across an exchange-traded fund, it's just a very well-understood, regulated way for people to invest in stocks and shares historically, or derivatives, and now Bitcoin is available. Since this launched at the beginning of the year, there's $74.4 billion that have been purchased in shares in Bitcoin ETFs. Just 7 days ago, Ethereum ETFs were approved. So the pace at which crypto and blockchain is being adopted by the financial mainstream is increasing rapidly, which I think makes sense. It needs to happen. And it's really great to see that the financial mainstream are now doing this. But it doesn't stop there. And I would say this is not an endorsement at all. It just so happens that Mr. Trump was speaking about this probably outside of court, is where he seems to be spending most of his time. But I think the point I'm trying to make here is that 3 years ago, 4 years ago, blockchain was very fringe. You certainly wouldn't have expected a president or a former president to be speaking about this. And the reason they are is because 1 in 5 Americans now own some sort of cryptocurrency. And to contextualize that for you, 48% of Americans have passports. So it's blockchain's half as popular as passports in America, which I think is kind of good news for adoption. But ultimately, is now an issue that is on the ballot sheet, which I think as far as people that are talking about it, you'll see it in the news more, people will campaign on this issue, is great news for adoption across the board. But it doesn't just stop in America. So myself, some of the team from Alchemy were invited to the House of Commons last Monday, which was a real privilege. We deal with a team at Coinbase, and in America, Coinbase launched an initiative called Stand with Crypto, where they are speaking to regulators, speaking to policymakers, speaking to politicians about the application of blockchain across a broad sector of businesses, not just financial instruments, to show that it has an application to solve problems really across the board. This was launched. We were part of 5 companies that were asked to kind of present our solution to a challenge that was outside of finance. And we got to speak to regulators, to policymakers. And there is a growing level of excitement in government around the application of blockchain. And really the UK, which has always been a financial services market, is really well positioned to take advantage of blockchain, a services-based solution, to have the UK become a global leader and really grow our economy, create jobs, and kind of put blockchain in many conversations that perhaps it hasn't been or has been limited to finances so far. And the reason we're invited is because we've spent a lot of time and effort building out a product that helps advertisers, that helps publishers, but another big part of our business is the blockchain. And really, to run an effective blockchain, you have to have validators, independent validators that support transactions, that host the network, and you have to incentivize those validators. And we're currently generating around about $1,500 of fees per day for people that are validating transactions on our network. And as you can see here, that puts us in the same ballpark as businesses like Ripple, Phantom, Monero, Polkadot, some like real heavy hitters in terms of the renownedness, I say, of those particular blockchains. And it proves that the model that we've created incentivizes validators in the right way, which allows us to offer the low fees, the transparency, and the reduced emissions that you'll see from buying ads on a blockchain. And that's really all in aid of moving us away from an industry and a market that maximizes margins. And I think that's a lot of, with the way that adtech was funded today, still a lot of venture capital. They obviously want to make money, they have high valuations to maintain, and that is done by large margins. What has been forgotten there is really the people that create the value online that typically aren't venture funded. You know, brands, I guess maybe they would be, but publishers that create the content, write the content, edit the content, post it online. And then all of us in this room, you know, that use the internet, that have been bombarded with ads for a very long time, that have had our data sold without us really knowing necessarily that took place, and kind of re-establishing that value exchange online. You know, like a publisher creates content to draw some eyeballs to that. An advertiser wants to show their brand to those eyeballs, and that is kind of a virtuous circle, but kind of move past that with intermediaries taking perhaps too much, perhaps just enough, depending on who you ask. So really, in using a distributed ledger, in having transparency and reducing the fees, you're able to re-establish that value exchange online, ultimately in the aid of keeping the internet ad funded. You know, have as much content, as much information freely accessible to whoever wants to reach it, to learn, to understand the news, to develop new skills, whatever it may be. The best version of the internet is a freely accessible ad funded internet. And that's why Alchemy exists. You know, we have spent 3 years now building out an ad exchange, 4 if you count all the times that Charlie and I sat in our respective bedrooms on Zoom calls, but it's been a long road to get here. And we do that in 3 ways. So we have a distributed ledger. That means that every single transaction is auditable. So we go from 5% of transactions being auditable to 100%. So if you're selling ads on our exchange, you know exactly what happened and the fees that were taken. And if you're buying ads on our exchange, you know exactly what happened and the fees that were taken. And you can see all of that information at a log level to inform you on how you might sell your ads differently, or how you might perhaps change your buying strategies to get better performance on the KPIs that you're being set by your brands, to really enhance the efficiency overall. And that's facilitated by lower fees. So really, again, in using a distributed network, we're able to bring those fees down to provide media agencies and brands with more value for money, to provide publishers with more revenue for the ads that they're selling, and then us as internet users, because those two people that are providing value are getting more for it, there'll be fewer ads online. Our experience will be better. There'll be less energy required to facilitate the fewer transactions because CPMs are higher and you're attracting more audiences and win rates are higher. You know, the whole market becomes much more efficient when fees are lower and data is more readily available. And that has a net impact on the amount of emissions that are produced. And I think emissions being produced is one way of looking at it, but because the digital ad industry produces more emissions than the aviation industry, really another way of thinking about that is that it's responsible for over 3% of all of the energy usage in the world, which is kind of nuts, but makes sense when you look at the size of the market. And really, with Ethereum being the underlying technology and its move to proof of stake, which is a way in which transactions are validated without going into too much detail, has meant that it's become much more energy efficient. It means that we're not having the impact that the digital ad industry has had in the past. And that was recognized last year. We became a B Corp, which was a lot of work, but really kind of is a stamp of approval from an authority that kind of really underpins the values that we hold at Alchemy. As I said, we learned a brief history lesson. We learned about the origins of Simba. We've seen the adoption of blockchain. We've seen that financial institutions are adopting it. Presidents are talking about it. UK government's talking about it. It's being adopted in a way that we've never seen before. And then I told you all about alchemy and the new era of adtech that's being supported by blockchain. So I've got a question for you. Anyone here that has a Nokia 3310, put their hand up. You do? You do as well? Okay, so 2. And who has a smartphone? So I think there you kind of really opted into, through your phones, using a better infrastructure to buy and sell ads, and you wouldn't use technology from 30 years ago. So why should we? There's now a new option to do it. We've created it, we've built it, Alchemy. So yeah, thank you very much for your time. I'll be around all day. So yeah, come and grab me if you want to ask any questions.